We talk about the war in the East. Historians often concentrate too much on the military and logistical implications of the war and use that framework to analyze why the Soviets performed so badly in the start of the war. A lot of people tend to cite the dual command structure of political commissars with a divisional commanders. They cite lack of resources like tanks, anti-tank guns. They cite how they scrapped all the defensive barriers along the Stalin line, and also the Great Purges. At least 35% of the officer corps of the Soviet military was purged. But this explains the what rather than the why. What led? Why did these decisions happen the way they happened? Because I've noticed a lot of YouTube channels tend to point to the micromanagement of either Hitler or Stalin as being a major obstacle toward the efficiency of the respective militaries. General Erich von Manstein of the Wehrmacht always cited Hitler as kind of a scapegoat as to why the Germans lost the war. Or on the Soviet side, a lot of historians tend to agree that Stalin made ridiculous decisions like the pointless counteroffensives that just made it way easier for the Germans to encircle their units at Bialystok-Minsk and Kiev. And that's all true. That's all very true, but it still ignores the critical juncture that led to this ability to micromanage. And it all stems from a sort of an ideological battle cited by historian Moshe Lewin between Stalin's view of being an autocratic ruler, much like a czar with unlimited powers in a sort of totalitarian way, versus a sort of nomenclatura system, a highly bureaucratized system of Soviet governance that ultimately prevailed after Stalin's death in the Soviet Union. And we have to sort of understand how the Union started, how it developed, to understand this sort of critical juncture. It obviously focuses on the Great Purges, but with a sort of a twist in the analysis. We're not really analyzing the fact that Stalin killed people like Marshal Tukhachevsky, or how he imprisoned Rokossovsky, or, all that stuff. We're really talking about the governmental and institutional changes that directly loosened the reins to his power, which then led to him being able to get away with micromanaging all these units without sufficient institutional constraints, like you would see in any other government in the time, probably, at least in the West. The Soviet Union, when it was founded, it was riddled in destruction. Millions had died because of the Russian Civil War. Agricultural output was less than the pre-World War I yields. For example, a country didn't have electricity, high literacy rate. It was pretty bad. So Lenin, who at this time was a Soviet leader, he relied heavily on the pre-revolutionary administrative bureaucrats, and sort of formed what we would call a technocracy. You can see technocracy is a system of governance where decision makers are selected on the basis of technological knowledge, and it's very true that the early Soviet Union, in my opinion, was sort of a technocracy. You can find similarities with the Islamic Republic of Iran under Ahmadinejad. He was a technocrat, an elected official that had a particular expertise, a technological knowledge. So he wasn't just but he wasn't just a regular career politician. He had some technological skills and expertise. So Lenin relied on people like this to sort of govern and administrate the Union. during the 1920s in the new economic policy. But this had ultimately created a framework of government with organs similar to Western countries. You had a constitution formulated in 1924, which set up a legislative branch, executive branch, and I think a judiciary, sort of like with Montesquieu's separation of powers. Don't take that as a word, but the legislative branch that was created was the Congress of Soviets of the Soviet Union. And this Congress of Soviets was sort of designed in a way that really promoted the idea of proletarian representation and rule of the working class. If we look just here, Article 9 of Chapter 3 of the Constitution reads, "The Congress of Soviets of the USSR is composed of representatives of the city and town Soviets on the basis of one deputy per 25,000 electors, and of representatives of the provincial congresses of Soviets on the basis of one deputy per 125,000 inhabitants." So obviously 25,000 electors, I'm sure that refers to the electors within the councils. So I guess these electors were the local council members, and they pretty much picked the deputy that they wanted to represent. So it's a bit of a pyramid scheme where in the bottom you had, let's just draw it for a second, make it seem like a pyramid scheme where in the bottom you had the population, the normal people, and so on, and then they in turn elected a city council, but this council, I guess, was for various cities, and several of these councils, I guess, elected one deputy. That's how I'm thinking it was structured. But even then, you had a system, provincial system with 125,000 inhabitants that's sort of similar to the U.S. House of Representatives. You could see the problems here, that this creates a lot of micro interest groups because of the fact that each deputy isn't really representing that many people. The proportions are quite low if you compare it to the Constitution of 1936, which I'm about to get at. So this creates a lot of micromanagement groups, and since the town and city Soviets are at such a localized level, it creates interest groups with unique interests, unique to those cities and geographic areas, whereas at least provincial deputies would have to aggregate sort of the interest of all the different people living in these provinces, if that makes sense. So that made it harder for Stalin to establish a patron-client network to ensure the loyalty of all these deputies, because one deputy might want something that's contradictory to another one might not want something that's very specific and pointless, like a lot of specific demands that don't allow coalition building, especially in a legislative body. Think how the Republicans and the Democrats work. They're too aggregated, in my opinion. That's why people feel like they're not doing anything. Whereas if you go to a proportionally represented country, you might feel like there are too many representations and views that you have gridlock, i.e., even though the UK is not proportionally represented, it does have a parliament that has a coalition form. Let's use Germany as an example, as a proportionally representative, I believe. You could see how there's gridlock, whereas at least in the US system. Anyway, I digress. So let's compare this. When Stalin initiated the Great Purges, he abolished the Constitution of 1924 and introduced the Constitution of 1936, which created the Supreme Soviet, as we see here. And in Article 34, it can be said that the Soviet of this union is elected by the citizens of the USSR according to electoral areas on the basis of one deputy for every 300,000 people. So what he did here, he directly challenged the micro interests of all these city and local representatives and aggregated their interests, forced them to pretty much have general interests, where he even nearly doubled the provincial proportions. So he tried to pretty much force the country to adhere to general interests that would be easier for him to contain, or at least for him to control. He could easily influence one deputy instead of having to influence like 5 other deputies. Because in the Congress system, he'd probably have to I'm not going to do the math right now, like 6, 7 deputies. He'd have to influence each of them with different interests through a patron-client system, which is very cumbersome. Whereas here, just has to do it with 1 deputy. So this leads to a centralization of power that really destroys the weak limitations to his ability to micromanage. Because the parliament was a rubber stamp, but now it's become an even bigger rubber stamp where it doesn't even have a function anymore. It's just a propaganda tool. And what I'm explaining with this critical juncture, really, what it did for the Soviet Union, it set a precedence where pretty much Stalin could coalition build the way Putin is coalition building with the United Russia Party and the Liberal Democrats, which not the same as the UK, but the Liberal Russia. That sort of structure, which makes Putin smart, but that led to complacency because Stalin could get away with everything. It set a precedence where ultimately he had the ability to micromanage in the start of the war. Obviously, historians like Gregory Fries, in his book A Russia History, he cites that this centralization also went another 2 ways. It also helped consolidate power in the Soviet Union to ensure an effective mobilization in response to the German invasion, strong centralized economic policy, and relocation of industrial resources to the Urals. But I just wanted to give a sort of short video. I know I haven't posted that many in a while. I'm sorry I haven't. I've been moving a lot. But I hope you all find this quite interesting to see the institutional developments that led to such atrocity.